This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. Good morning, good afternoon. It's just gone afternoon here in Queensland for those who are joining from this state. I know we've got a good number of people who are joining from interstate today as well. So thanks everyone for joining us for today's free CPR Group webinar, during which we are talking all things Constitution. Those of you who know us well know that we love constitutions. We're a little nerdy, and some even say that we probably need to get a bit of a life because we spend so much time talking about constitutions. And what we really love about this topic is that we can take a concept that is a little bit daunting and scary for some people and make things a little easier to understand, break them down into hopefully lay terms, and hopefully you'll finish this session having a good grasp on what the elements of a good, according to our opinion, constitution look like, and also where maybe some of the more nitty-gritty operational things should go rather than in your constitution. So it is, as always, important that we acknowledge that the traditional custodians of the land on which we all join, from which we all join today's session, have been walked for tens of thousands of years by those before us, the traditional custodians of the land. I join today from Cubby country, and I'm very fortunate to have grown up in a quiet little community tucked in amongst the cane fields of Bly on the Maroochy River, and spent any opportunity I possibly could out there on the water, fishing, water skiing, going camping with friends up the river. We'd head up Friday afternoon, wouldn't come home till Sunday afternoon. Mum and Dad weren't at all concerned about any of us. They knew we'd get home safely. We probably didn't do as good a job of fishing the rivers as the Cubby traditional owners did and have for many thousands of years. But I'm really fortunate that I got to enjoy that connection to country as a youngster here on the Sunshine Coast. So, of course, I pay my respects to the Cubby traditional custodians and respect to their elders past and present, and also emerging leaders. I'd also like to acknowledge the people, place and the spirit of the lands from which you all join today, wherever that might be across this wonderful country of ours. And we might even have people joining from across the ditch. I know that there were some people registered from New Zealand. So as always, thank you very much for joining us. I'm really keen to have any questions that come in for those to do so through the session. So don't feel as though you need to wait until the end of the session to ask any questions that you've got. You can pop those in the chat at any time. As I'm talking through some of the FAQs that we often get posed when we're talking about constitutions, that may give rise to other questions in your mind. So as I say, please feel free to pop those in the chat and we'll address those towards the end of the session. And as we did last session, what we're going to do is take an FAQs approach to this webinar, and we're going to talk through, like I say, some of the kind of really common questions that we get asked in supporting organisations, not-for-profit clubs, societies, associations, organisations that are looking to modernise their governance documents and bring them into line with not only the provisions of the legislation under which they are established as a legal entity, but also, really importantly, in line with good business practice. And I use that word business really deliberately, and for those of you who've joined us for webinars in the past, you'll know that we make no apologies for coming back to this question almost every chance we get. And that question is, what does not-for-profit really mean? It's a stupid term, and it's a term that misleads a lot of people to make poor financial decisions when they are involved in committees of not-for-profit organisations. So the only real, genuine, accurate definition of not-for-profit is that if you're a not-for-profit entity, you can't distribute any profits amongst your members. So the term not-for-profit actually means your organisation exists not for the profit of its members. However, because if you take a few letters away, you can get the words no profit out of the term not-for-profit. it misleads a lot of decision makers, and that can even happen subconsciously, whereby people think, oh, well, we're just volunteers and we are not here primarily. Our organisation was not set up to make money. Our organisation was set up to provide opportunities for participation in sport or arts or cultural activities or to run an annual event. We weren't set up to make money. So that self-limiting belief, which often, like I say, is subconscious, can hold people on committees back from making good decisions. And that's one of the big challenges that we face as consultants that operate every single day in the not-for-profit sector, is to break down this misconception that not-for-profit means something like no profit. If you asked most members of your organisation what not-for-profit means, they'd probably give you some variation on: you can't make too much money, you can't make too much profit, you can't have too much money in the bank at any given time. And all of that is baloney. None of it applies. There is no amount of money that your organisation can generate by way of revenue in any year which will jeopardise your not-for-profit status. Similarly, there is no limit to the amount of money that your organisation can have in the bank before anyone comes and takes your not-for-profit status away. It just ain't going to happen, ever, unequivocally. So the only thing that not-for-profit means is you can't give your profits to your members. Therefore, I think that a more appropriate definition than not-for-profit, or term than not-for-profit, would be profit for purpose. If we make a profit as a not-for-profit organisation, the only thing that we can do with that profit is use that to deliver on our purpose. So we are making profit for purpose. And how do you determine what the purpose is of your organisation? You go to that thing we're talking a lot about in this session, your constitution. And pretty early on in that document will be your objects. And we'll talk more about what they look like later on. But they spell out the reasons that your organisation was established, why it exists today, what is it intended to achieve as an organisation. That's your objects, that's your purpose. And if everything that you do with the money that you make and the profit that you generate is delivering on those objects, then there's nothing wrong. And this is why I advocate for people on committees to think, instead of not-for-profit, to think profit for purpose. Because as soon as you apply that lens over your decision making, you're far more likely to make decisions which lead to the long-term success and positive outcomes for your organisation and its members and service recipients and so on, than if you're always striving, not to make too much money, or not to make too much profit, because we're just a not-for-profit, So now it is time to leave that notion behind. The next really common question that we get asked is, what are our legal obligations? What is it that that actually exists in the way of justification for us being incorporated? Because it comes with a bit of compliance requirements. We've got to have a constitution, for instance, and we've got to have an AGM, and we've got to elect a committee. So why is it important that we are even incorporated? And to help articulate this particular answer, I'm going to draw you a little diagram. So I'm going to jump over to a different camera here, and I'm going to stop that share. And I'm going to draw you a little diagram that I know that some of you have seen. So if you imagine firstly that we've got this group of people and they all are interested in doing the same sort of activity, okay? So that might be playing a sport, that might be doing some type of art or craft, running an event and so on. So these people are all interested in the same activity. So what they do is they come together and they form a group of people. They call it a club, but this is not yet an incorporated association. And today, in our context of the discussion about constitutions, we're largely talking about incorporated associations. There are a range of other legal structures which exist in Australia under which a not-for-profit organisation might exist. So that includes companies limited by guarantee. And instead of reporting to a state authority that incorporated associations report to, a company limited by guarantee reports to ASIC. Now, you might also be an Indigenous corporation, and that would report, instead of to ASIC, to ORIC, the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations. In the university sector, we've got a whole host of not-for-profit organisations, and some of those, student guilds for instance, are actually established under the University Act, under the Act that created the university itself. So there are a range of legal structures, but by far and above the most common legal structure for not-for-profits here in Australia is incorporation. And there are, just here in Queensland, for instance, there are almost 30,000 incorporated associations at any given time. So the discussion that we're having today is broadly applicable to not-for-profits. Based on the pure numbers, most of what I talk through is going to be largely kind of founded around the structure of an incorporated association. So regardless of what legal structure you operate under, and we'll come back to that in just a moment, imagine for a moment that in this scenario, we've got an organisation that actually isn't an organisation because it's just a group of people. And like I say, they might call themselves a club. Now, in this scenario, like in many others before it, this large group of people identified that for them to be involved in every decision was not efficient. So what they did was they put a smaller group of people in charge of making decisions, and they call them a committee. Now, in this scenario, imagine that something goes wrong somewhere along the way. Remember, it is this group of people who are making decisions, because involving all of these people is a little bit inefficient, and something goes wrong. Someone over here gets injured. And where do they go when they get injured? They go to the hospital. And the people at the hospital say, goodness me, you're badly injured. It's going to cost you a lot of money to get better. And that person says, I don't have a lot of money. And the people at the hospital say, this is a really simplified explanation, mind you, and scenario. The people at the hospital say, go and see a solicitor and they'll help you find some money. Now, when I was once having a discussion in this context, I had a solicitor in the room. And I said, so where is the solicitor going to go looking for money? And this particular solicitor said, well, I'd sue everybody. But in reality, in this very simplified scenario, I suggest that there could be very genuine exposure for this smaller group of people who've been making decisions on behalf of this larger group of people. So now let's just rewind and let's imagine that instead of operating as an unincorporated entity or a group of people in that reality, this group of people actually goes to the extent of setting up an incorporated association. Now that incorporated association, depending on the state that you operate in, will come with certain compliance obligations. You'll have to have a certain number of members. I touched on some of these earlier. You'll need to have a constitution and you'll need to have an AGM at which you elect your decision makers, i.e. committee members or board members. You've got to get your financial statements verified or audited depending on how much money you make and have in the bank. And you've got to submit some reports to your regulatory authority. So your annual return after your AGM, once you've presented that information to members and had them elect your committee members, you've then got to submit a report to your authority to say, here's how much money we've made and spent and here's who's been elected to our committee and so on. Now, what the establishment of that incorporated association creates is separation. Separation, importantly, from the members of the organisation. So we now have, in the eyes of the law, an incorporated association, a body corporate with perpetual succession. Body corporate means legal entity. In the eyes of the law, this entity, your club, can do anything that any one person can do. It can own land, lease land, it can have bank accounts that it holds in its name, it can make money through a range of revenue generating activities, and it can put that money into the bank accounts that it holds in its name. It can sue and be sued, and it can enter into contracts for insurance to protect decision makers and to protect people who are part of the club against money that they might need to spend to get themselves better if they're injured, for instance, to use this simplified scenario here. So the creation of a legal entity provides very affordable protection for the decision makers, because if we now go back to our scenario from earlier on and imagine that this scenario has played out and we've got someone coming to look for money, typically speaking, under ordinary circumstances, and as long as these decision makers here act in line with their legal duties as committee members and as people who are managing a body corporate, as long as they make decisions in the way that a reasonably careful and prudent person would make decisions, they are afforded protection because of this incorporation, because of this separation, and because this is a legal entity seen in the eyes of the law in the same way that a person is seen, they are protected as long as they do the right thing. Can you go to jail for doing the wrong thing as a committee member of an incorporated association? Of course you can, yes. If you defraud that organisation of money, you steal money, then yes, you can, and people have gone to jail. But in this scenario, this separation is a really affordable degree of protection for this group of decision makers. So that's a crash course, like I say, in why it's important to be incorporated. I hope that you could see my little diagram there relatively clearly. And I'll now reshare my screen so that you can see what I can see. But that hopefully will help to lay the foundations. If you're asking the question, or you have members asking the question of you, why are we even incorporated? I mentioned the legal structure, which is body corporate with perpetual succession. Body corporate means legal entity, as I've established. Perpetual succession means the people who are in those decision-making positions change over time. The people who are in the positions of president and treasurer and secretary and vice president and so on, they're going to change over time. But the incorporated association, the legal entity, will carry on in perpetuity. It's legal agreements with governing bodies or with your local council for your lease or other form of tenure. That entity is going to carry on. It's just the people who are in the decision-making positions who are elected, for instance, at your AGM, that will change over time. So we have then, over the course of almost 3 decades of writing constitutions, we have established some of the kind of fundamental principles, as far as we see it, of a good constitution. So we suggest that your constitution should not be a document that you set and forget. You shouldn't just say, all right, well, we've updated our constitution in 2025. We're not going to need to think about that again in my time frame. A constitution is a contract between your members and the organisation itself, the body corporate. So it's important that at the very least, your decision makers are familiar with that document and its contents. Your members should also ideally read and be familiar with your constitution, but it's particularly critical that your committee read and understand it. And also, and for the reasons that we'll talk through shortly in terms of what can go wrong if we don't follow our constitution, it's important that that document is referred to regularly so that you're running your meetings appropriately. The processes for managing membership applications and admissions is conducted in line with your constitution. So it's not a document that you should set to the side once you've written it and think you won't need to look at it again. Unfortunately, constitutions typically come out when something goes wrong and someone wants to get rid of someone else from an organisation. Your constitution, kind of goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, needs to be legally compliant. The document must align, well, there's a caveat on that. I think it must align with the provisions of the legislation under which you are established as a legal entity. Now, there are instances in the incorporated association legislation across the country, in each state and territory, that say, look, if there are little bits of your constitution which don't align with some of the little bits in the legislation, so under the Associations Incorporation Act, for instance, in your state or territory, then the Act prevails. The Act is always going to win. So you don't, however, have an obligation, there's no mandate as an incorporated association to update your constitution when the incorporation legislation is updated. However, if your constitution says something different from what the Act says, the Act always wins. So you might have a situation where you've got people who really know a lot about your constitution because they've been there for a long time, they've read it, they understand it, and they're fellow governance nerds. But they might be right across old documentation. They might be really familiar with a constitution that doesn't any longer actually align with the legislation. And in every state and territory, we do have updates to the legislation that impact your organisation's obligations. So it's important to keep your document up to date, in our opinion, to ensure that you don't have any of those inconsistencies which can lead to frustrations and disagreements at AGMs, for instance. We have a broad principle that we operate under at CPR Group, which is that your board or management committee, whatever you call them, you might call them an executive committee, but that committee is elected to govern. And in most instances across the country, incorporation legislation says that the minimum number of meetings for your committee is greater. You have to have more frequent committee meetings than you do general meetings. And general meetings are meetings at which any member who can vote can turn up and have their say. So that very fact alone tells us that the number of committee meetings you should have should be more than the number of general meetings that you have. Therefore, most of your decisions should be made at your committee meetings. That's where your primary decision making should take place. Now, some things you've got to have a general meeting, or you've got to ask your members to approve at a general meeting, and that includes changing your constitution. We'll come back to that shortly. It also includes changing your name, deciding to merge or amalgamate with another incorporated association, deciding to wind up. If you're going to make big decisions like those, then those decisions need to be made at a general meeting. And that might be your AGM, or it might be a special general meeting called for that purpose. There's also other stuff that you've got to do at your AGM, like I've touched on, electing your committee members, accepting your financial statements, maybe appointing your auditor, and so on. So your management committee, board, executive, whatever you call them, they are the ones who are elected to make decisions. Therefore, you should let them do so. The Constitution should provide the mechanisms for that committee to be the most regular decision-making body within the organisation. We should not, in my opinion, have a scenario whereby we elect a committee, but then every single meeting that we have every month, for instance, is a general meeting. Because through that scenario, you're essentially saying, right, to you committee members who are elected at the AGM, it's your backsides on the line, and you're the ones who need to ensure that you're legally, you're abiding by your legal duties and you're making decisions in the way that a reasonably careful and prudent person would. You're accountable for the organisation's sound decision making. So although you are protected and afforded that protection by virtue of your incorporated association's status as a body corporate, you still have to do the right thing. You're still accountable for the decisions that your committee makes. And therefore, you should be able to make those decisions as a committee. But if we take that power away from you then and have all of these general meetings, and some organisations with which we work do, they have monthly general meetings. Anyone can turn up, third Tuesday of the month, open general meeting of members. And the committee never has meetings to make important decisions. So this is, like I say, something that should be enshrined in your constitution by virtue of more regular committee meetings than general meetings. And allow your committee to get on with the job of running your club. Your constitution should be reflective of your club and good governance, as well as compliant with the legislation. It should provide a degree of simplicity and flexibility. Get some of the more nitty-gritty stuff out of your constitution and put it in other documents like bylaws, and we'll come back to that shortly. And as far as you reasonably can, you should attempt to future-proof your constitution. Try and write the sections and clauses in a way that is going to continue to support your organisation for the longer term rather than just right now. And one of the best ways to achieve that, as I've just touched on, is to include an appropriate degree of simplicity and flexibility in there. And for some of the more nitty-gritty content to be in other documents. So, what then should be in our constitution? Here are some broad sections. Now, this does depend to a degree on your state and the legislation under which you are established as a legal entity. However, some of these are fundamental and apply across the country. So your legal name, your name as an incorporated association or other body corporate, depending on your legal structure, as I mentioned earlier, must be reflected in your constitution. The objects of your organisation. What's our purpose? Why do we exist? Why were we set up, and why are we still around? What are the powers of your organisation? Typically speaking, and this relates to my wonderful little discussion earlier that I pointed to my diagram from to say your organisation is seen in the eyes of the law as a person. So your organisation therefore has the powers of an individual. And typically speaking, most contemporary constitutions just say that. Instead of setting out the 24 or 25 things that a person can do as a legal, a person with legal status in society, it just says our organisation has the legal powers of an individual. So it's far simpler, and it takes up a little section of a page rather than 2 pages, for instance. Your constitution should really set out, and in some states must set out, certain matters relating to membership. So this might be your classes of membership, for instance, which are the different categories of membership, and importantly, who's allowed to vote at our general meetings like our AGM, and who's allowed to be elected to our committee. What's the process of people applying for membership? How do we set our membership fees? Now, this is a bit of a bone of contention for me here in Queensland, that the model rules have a provision. So the model rules are a template constitution that are provided to make it easy for new organisations becoming incorporated to get set up and to be compliant from the outset. But the model rules here in Queensland have a provision that states the fees for ordinary members and any other class of membership are determined by the members at a general meeting. Now, I don't know of any successful businesses which ask their customers what they want to pay for a product or service. So your club shouldn't ask either. I suggest very strongly that your committee who are elected to govern should make that decision. So if your constitution says that you put the decision for setting fees to your members, consider that that might be something really important to get changed. The constitution should also set out the process of people being admitted to membership or rejecting any applications, the process for kicking someone out or reprimanding or disciplining members, what's the appeal rights that a member has, and how do we manage grievances or disagreements in our club. Your constitution should also then set out certain details about your committee or your board. And we suggest that you keep this relatively high level so that that provides flexibility as to what positions you actually need to best serve your club over time, and the fact that your club's needs will change over time. So in some states, your legislation is going to require that you've got certain positions, and that might be things like president and treasurer, for instance. There might be other non-committee positions which you've got to have, like public officer or secretary. The secretary in many states can either be a member of the management committee or not. And we suggest that other than that, you kind of provide in your constitution that the members can decide what other positions will be filled by election. And that, like I say, gives you the opportunity to be a little flexible over time. So some other considerations that aren't necessarily top of mind for a lot of organisations when they're writing a constitution are, should we be considering some gender equity or diversity provisions for our management committee? Particularly in sport, we have for many years experienced a significant underrepresentation of females in the boardroom. So should your constitution maybe have enshrined in it some requirements to have at least a certain percentage of representation across genders? Do we want to set maximum terms in office? Do we want to limit the amount of time that people can be in their positions and be re-elected to those positions? Or do we want to allow the members to afford the members that right to decide? What are the processes for removing someone from office and for filling casual vacancies and so on? Your constitution should also talk through meetings. So how frequently do we meet? As I said earlier, it should be your committee that meets more frequently than your broader membership base. What's the process for taking minutes? How many people do we need to have present to achieve a quorum, which is the minimum number required before you can even declare a meeting open, let alone actually make decisions? Are there provisions for your committee to make decisions in writing? If you can't have a meeting, can the committee send around a reply all email and have everyone agree, or at least a majority agree? And again, that'll depend on the provisions of your constitution, whether it's every committee member or a majority who need to sign off on a written resolution, or round robin flying minute are some of the other terms used for that decision-making mechanism. But it's a great way to ensure that you're not hamstrung if you need to make a decision and you simply can't get together as a priority in person or online. Are you allowed to meet online? What are the processes for that? Do you allow proxies at your general meetings? Now, proxies are a bone of contention in some organisations because they've been misused to stack meetings and get a certain outcome by just a small number of people who go around and say, oh, Barry, are you going to the AGM this weekend? Oh, just give me a proxy form. I'll vote on your behalf. Jenny, are you going to the AGM this week? And so on. So that's a decision for your organisation to make as to whether your constitution is going to provide for proxies or not. Then your constitution's got to talk about some money stuff. When does your financial year end? You can choose when you want your financial year to end, unless if there's a requirement by virtue of your affiliation with a governing body or because of your liquor or other licenses that might determine when your financial year has to end. And you'll have to have your AGM within either 5 or 6 months of that financial year end date, depending on which state you're in. And you can determine based on that particular reality, when do you want to have your AGM? Use that as the primary determining factor, I suggest, for when you want to finish your financial year. Processes for how you make and receive money, what your financial record keeping processes look like, and so on. Then we've got some provisions for how your constitution is amended, and I'll come back to that in just a moment, and any indemnifications or insurances that your organisation might offer for its decision makers. So these are the fundamental provisions that should be in your constitution. What shouldn't be in your constitution? Here, this is kind of a how long's a piece of string question, but some of the fundamental things that I often do see in constitutions that I don't think should be in there are operational provisions. So maybe position descriptions, for instance. What are the duties of the key committee members? That stuff should be in bylaws. What are our codes of conduct as an organisation? That also should be in bylaws or form a separate policy. Who gets what benefits for their membership level? That should be in a membership policy or in bylaws. Your constitution needs, when it comes to your members, to talk about 2 key factors: who can vote and who can be on the committee. So all of the nitty-gritty about who can play on which days of the week or who gets access to the fields or courts for how many days in the week, who gets a certain degree of coaching access, all of that stuff should not be in your constitution. That's too nitty-gritty. And your regulatory authority, to put it bluntly, just doesn't care about that stuff. That stuff should be in your bylaws. Details about fee discounts. For instance, if you provide a certain number of hours in a voluntary capacity, you might get discounted fees this year or next year. Your competition rules, the nitty-gritty stuff about administering your sport if you're a sporting organisation. Your colours as a club, that stuff should not be in your constitution. That stuff should be in your bylaws. Again, your regulatory authority doesn't care. And what if you're going to go through a process of changing that? You don't really want to have to change your constitution just because you're changing your colours. Also, the more detailed meeting rules, which are often referred to as standing orders. So the rules according to which meetings run, some of that nitty-gritty I suggest should be in your bylaws. So that is by no means an exhaustive list, and I've seen plenty of other things that are in constitutions that shouldn't be there. But the rule of thumb is, does our regulatory authority require, or the legislation under which we're established as a body corporate require that stuff to be in our constitution? Do we want to have these matters enshrined in the constitution so they are difficult to change? In those cases, then it's got to be in your constitution. Or do we want it to be in the constitution for practical reasons, so it's just the one location that people have to go? Recognising that I suggest that your constitution, really, you don't want to be much longer than 25 pages. Some that we write are more like 30 pages because they're quite complex, and they're maybe governing body constitutions that provide for their branches and regions and affiliates and so on. So some constitutions do get a little longer than 25 pages, but if yours is longer than 25 pages, it might be an indication that there's some stuff in there that can come out. So what happens if our constitution says something different from the law? So as I touched on earlier, if there's anything that the legislation under which you're established as a body corporate says that's different from what your constitution says, the the Act always prevails. The Act always wins. So this is one of the fundamental reasons, as I mentioned earlier, that we suggest you should have a constitution that is up to date and which complies and aligns with the legislation. Even though there's no legal mandate for you to necessarily update your constitution when the legislation is amended, it makes good sense. What happens if our club doesn't follow our constitution? Now, this again is specific to the various legislation across the country, and it's important, however, to note that the consistency across the states and territories is that, typically speaking, the penalties that are issuable to the committee members. So yes, various pieces of legislation across the country do impose or do provide for penalties to be imposed on an incorporated association, but some of the more significant penalties are actually issuable upon breach of the legislation to the individuals, to the people who are filling those committee positions. So again, back to my little scenario earlier, while your incorporation or legal status does afford the committee members and decision makers some protection against poor decision making which leads to injury or damage to property, and that is by virtue of your legal status. And on top of that, your incorporated association or other legal entity might take out insurance to provide further protection for the decision makers. Recognising all of that, we still have a requirement as committee members to abide by the provisions of our constitution and to abide by the provisions of the legislation under which we are incorporated. So, and if we fail to do that, there are penalties issuable by our regulatory authority or state or territory government. So it's important to note that you can very easily go and have a look at the legislation under which you're incorporated, have a look at the website of your regulatory authority, and you'll be able to find pretty easily details of the specific penalties that are issuable. Now, I will say that in many cases, regulatory authorities that oversee and administer incorporated associations are there to help you. It is less common for you to just be slapped with a fine as an incorporated association management committee member than it is for that regulatory authority to come and help you and want to assist in getting you out of the difficult situation in which you might find yourself, particularly if you've taken over from a previous committee that didn't do the right thing and you're now in a real challenging situation trying to get compliant. A regulatory authority is typically going to want to come and help you out of that situation, get you into a position where you're compliant once again, rather than just getting you in trouble, slapping you with a fine and shutting your incorporated association down. If you continue to do the wrong thing consistently as an individual or an organisation, that ultimate authority does, of course, exist for you to be shut down or for you to be issued penalties. But it's important to note that you don't want to sweep problems under the carpet and try and hide things from a regulatory authority. What you want to do is you want to get onto that authority and you want to work with them to share with them any challenges that you're facing, because typically speaking, they do want to help you. So we've identified that our constitution is out of date and the document does no longer align with the legislation that we're incorporated under. What do? The process for adopting your constitution should take the time that it takes. So depending on which state or territory you're in, there might be either a set of model rules, a template constitution, or a guide for creating your own rules or constitution that aligns with and meets the requirements of the legislation. So the first part of the answer to this question is it depends which state or territory you're in. But broadly speaking, you will be able to access supporting documentation from your regulatory authority. We are also here to help, and I'll give you a link that you can use to get our help directly in just a moment. And like I say, the process should take the time that it takes. Some organisations have broad agreement across their committee and their members that it's time for a new constitution. We've got to update this thing. It's really out of date. We know the legislation's been amended. Here in Queensland, for instance, our legislation was amended in 2020, but the changes have been taking effect incrementally, with some taking effect in 2020, some in 22, and then the final changes taking effect in July last year, 2024. So it's important to be familiar with your current operating environment and to understand whether your constitution aligns with the act as it exists in your state or territory or not. Then it's a matter of following a process of consultation. And here's really where I'm pointing to the need for your process to take the time that it needs, because you might also not be in a situation where all of your members are just in broad agreement. And you might have some people saying, well, I wrote that constitution 20 years ago and I think that it still stacks up because I gave willingly of many, many hours of my own life to write that document. So even subliminally, maybe, or subconsciously, I'm really attached to that document. So you're going to have to make a really strong case as to why we need a new one. So you might find that in some members' cases, it takes a little more consultation and it takes a process of giving people an opportunity to have their say and to identify things that they think should be changed in your draft new constitution or your current one if you're using that as the basis. And only once you get to the point where you've got that consensus, and look, you're not going to keep everybody happy all of the time, and the legislation under which you're incorporated recognises that. So when it comes time that you've got agreement or consensus amongst most of your members that we're happy with the document and we're ready to put it to a general meeting for adoption, you then either at an AGM or a general meeting called specifically for the purpose of adopting your new constitution, you present what's called a special resolution. So a special resolution is one that doesn't only need a simple majority, so more than half of the members present and eligible to vote yes, but you actually need 75%. Now, this is a common misconception. I am not saying that you need 75% of all of your members to approve that special resolution. What I'm saying is that you need 75% of the people who are present and entitled to vote at that general meeting. Now, even that little present and entitled to vote does differ a little bit from state to state. In some states, it's 75% of everyone who's at the meeting and allowed to vote. In some states and territories, it's just 75% of the people who actually participate in the vote. So if someone abstains, you don't count their vote for the purpose of determining whether you've got your 75% majority or not. But again, we are here to help, and on the next slide I'm going to give you a contact form so that you can get in touch with us directly and we can help you with that process. So again, this differs from state to state, but in most cases, your new constitution as an incorporated association only takes effect once it has been registered by your regulatory authority. In some cases, it's when you lodge your document with them, but in most cases, like I say, it is only when you receive confirmation from your regulatory authority that yes, your rules of association or constitution has now been registered as your constitution. And the time frame within which you must lodge that new constitution with your regulatory authority after the meeting of members at which it is adopted by special resolution is generally between 1 and 3 months, depending again on which state or territory you're in. So it's a big decision to change your constitution, and that's why we need a special resolution. It is not a decision that can simply be made by your committee, but one that must be made by the members at a general meeting. So if you are unsure whether your constitution complies with the legislation in your state or territory, I strongly encourage you to upload a copy of your constitution at that URL link there. So cprgroup.com.au/constitution assessment. Really imaginative name, I know. Or you can scan that QR code that's on your screen right now. And that will take you to a dedicated page on our website that has a form, very simple form you can fill in, give us some details. You can upload a copy of your constitution to that form if you've got a digital copy handy, or if you don't, you can send it to us subsequently. But the sooner we get hold of that constitution, the sooner we can conduct an obligation-free assessment of the document, and we will give you a report that says, here are the reasons that we suggest that document should be updated. Here are the things where your constitution falls short and does not align with the provisions of the legislation under which you're incorporated, and therefore you may consider writing a new document, or of course, we can help you with that process. So when we work with an organisation to write a new constitution, we make it really easy. We do all the heavy lifting. We follow a process whereby we ask you a handful of questions. We take the answers that you give us to those questions away and we write a first draft constitution. We give you a constitution draft that is also complemented by what we call a covering note of between 1 and 3 pages. And that covering note talks through the key changes, the key things that are different in your draft new constitution compared with your current one. We then guide you through the process of consulting with your members and socialising that document with them to get their feedback. Then once everyone's happy with the document, or at least the consensus is we're ready to adopt, we guide you through the process of actually adopting that document at a general meeting, and we'll even fill in the application form to lodge it with your regulatory authority. So we make the process very easy. It costs a bit of money for us to do that, but in many organisations' cases, they recognise the return on that investment is that they can make sure they get the process right the first time, the constitution gets accepted by the regulatory authority the first time, and they can focus on doing what they do best, which is delivering your sport, activity, events, and so on. So if you're interested, feel free to get in touch, cprgroup.com.au/constitution assessment. That brings us to the end of today's content, and thereby an opportunity for me to flag with you our remaining webinars in this year's free CPR Group webinar series. So we're talking meetings on the 23rd of October, powerful meetings, powerful results, and on the 13th of November, we will be talking about club legal requirements. So that one, again, delves a little more deeply into some of the really important obligations and duties of committee members, and hopes to demystify that reality of committee members who want to do the right thing. So as always, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been great to see some familiar names online and wonderful to see some new names as well. Always great to see the reach that we're getting with these webinars. If you're interested in podcasts, I would strongly suggest, and I know that some of the people online today are avid Basket Case Clubs listeners. Basket Case Clubs is our podcast launched during COVID. And for the last few years, Michael, my brother, and I have been tackling some of the common challenges that basket case clubs face, but also sharing some tips and tricks and guidance that we've seen clubs employ and that we've helped others employ to become showcase clubs. So we're coming up to our 100th episode, and if you're a podcast type person, I strongly encourage you to jump on and have a listen. You can also always, of course, submit to us any suggestions for topics that you'd like to see addressed in our Basket Case Clubs episodes. Feel free to contact us at cprgroup.com.au, and if you have loved today's session, as always, feel free to head over to Google, scan that QR code, and give us a 5-star review. Okay, so I've just had a question that's come in the chat. If there are any other questions that anyone has, please feel free to let me know. But one of our people online have asked whether they'll be able to watch this session again from the beginning. Yes, so we have recorded today's session, and we will share with you a link to a recording of today's session, so that you can A, head back and watch it yourself, and B, you might like to share this with other committee members in your organisation as well. So feel free to do so. Thank you very much, as always, like I say, for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you all online for this session of a little under an hour today. We are always a phone call or an email away. We are real people. We exist at the end of the phone. You can get in touch with us on our 1-800 number on our website, or send us an email via our web link page on our website. Without further ado, I will wish you all the best for the rest of your day, and until we meet again in October for our next session, stay well and enjoy your volunteer role. Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Basket Case Clubs acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country on which we record. being Yugambeh, Turrbal, Jagera and Kabi Kabi land. We recognise their enduring connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to First Nations listeners.